Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card. We are the show for people who want to think deeply about the books they read and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Mr. Brian Brinkman and Mr. RJB. And I'm really excited to get into this episode. But before we do that, I want to check in with you guys because it's December. It is the end of the year. Everybody's making their end of year lists. So I thought it'd be really fun if we could share our top 5 books that we've read this year. And Brian, I'm feeling really generous today. So if you want to include audiobooks, I'll allow it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and
I'll allow
super
that.
generous.
Wow.
That's good because I already have 2 in my top 5. So yeah,
Oh,
your
perfect.
allowance is essential.
That is something. What a nice person.
Incredible. Who wants to start?
I mean, I have a list.
Let's hear it.
I'll just read my list.
I want to hear yours.
Mhm.
These are all fiction. So, and I think you guys have seen these, so it doesn't even really make it's not going to do anything for you all, but it might for our listeners and viewers, because the end of the list is something that we're going to be talking about. Okay. Number 5 is Beautyland, which I just finished, which is one of the most unique and different kind of writing experiences that I've been fortunate enough to check out this year. It's about an alien girl, kind of. It's not really science fiction. It's just I'm not even going to try to describe these books. Beautyland is awesome. It's really great. It's a little bit different than kind of like your typical literature. Number 4 is Northwoods. Thank you, Brian Brinkman. We will be talking about that soon enough. Number 3 is The Safe Keep. Thank you, Megan. Number 2 is James. And number 1 is, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Do you know what it is? I think you both definitely know what it is. It's this book we're talking about today, The Bee Sting.
Yes. Awesome.
What a book.
What a killer list. I'm adding Beautyland to my list now. And James,
I just want to mention that 6 is Intermezzo, which I really loved, and I think has a lot of similarities between that and what we're talking about today. See, I'm like Brian. I can't just do 5.
Yeah, I had to break the rule.
Always more.
You guys want me to go through from 7 to 20 now, really quick?
I'm right. Into it. I love lists, so just please keep going.
I know you do. No, you go ahead, Brian.
So I just want to note I'm halfway through James, and I'm excited for you to read it, Megan. I'm excited for us to talk about it. There's a lot to get into there. I will also say this was a awakening year for me with reading. I was always kind of reading in a scattered manner, and conversations with you guys leading up to starting this got me reading an immense amount. I also discovered that my library rents audiobooks for free, which changed my entire life. I take my dogs on incredibly long walks in the morning, and I had a book with me at all times. Early morning hours listening to some of these books were some of the most joyous experiences of the entire year for me. But my number 5 read was a book I finished about a week or so ago called Plainsong by Kent Haruf. This is a book about a fictional town in eastern Colorado, explores a few individuals from the town, one of the teachers, his sons, a young teenage girl who's recently gotten pregnant, 2 farmers who live on the outskirts of town. And it's just an amazing exploration of small town America. It was written in the late 90s. I'm really, really big into anything movie-wise, music-wise, book-wise that describes the heartland of this country, and this book did to an extreme. The language was so simple, really, really beautiful. The way that it was structured, you jumped from character to character, saw everything from their perspective for 8-9 pages, and then moved on. And kind of similar to this book, had an ending that's a little bit fuzzy and a little bit controversial in a way that I really like. So really, really great book. Plainsong, I definitely recommend that. Number 4 for me was There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension by, and I apologize, I'm going to butcher this, Hanif Abdurraqib. This book is, I'm a huge basketball fan, and this book taps into basketball and life. And it goes through his experience growing up in Columbus, Ohio, following the rise of LeBron James in the early 2000s. Hanif is around my age, so we both were in high school experiencing this rise of LeBron, him going to Cleveland, what that experience was like, what it was like for all the success, but then the ultimate failure the first time he was in Cleveland, him going to Miami, him coming back to Cleveland, ultimately winning a championship, and really interspersing his own life with basketball, with challenges he went through, some of the most poetic, beautiful writing of the entire year that I consumed. And I recommend this book to anyone, basketball fan or not. It's an incredible book about life, about America. Number 3, These Truths by Jill Lepore, the greatest American history book I've ever read. If you have not read this, if you're looking for a way into American history, I cannot recommend this enough. And then I'm going to break the rules slightly. I've been battling about this for weeks now. Which is the better book, Northwoods or The Bee Sting? You know what, man? I'm taking the same approach I'm taking over in the fish world. There is no number one jam of the year this year in fish. There's multiple great jams, just high levels reached. For me, nothing got better than when I was reading Northwoods by Daniel Mason or The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. It's about a 6-week stretch in the middle of spring. And when I think about like how I want to feel when I read, it's those two books and what those two books did. So cannot wait to get into The Bee Sting here. Can't wait to get into Northwoods in a couple of months. But those two books just hit me on another level. Meg, what do you
So
got?
much good books. I would say I was really shocked by your statement that that was the best American history book you've ever read, because I think you may have read a lot. So that's pretty,
Quite a bit.
yeah, that's quite a selling point for that book. Okay, number 5, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. This book rocked my world. The use of multiple perspectives and the mixing of truth and non-truth, it just blew my mind open about what a memoir can be and about how malleable, fragile, and subjective the truth is. Absolutely incredible book. Number 4 is The Safe Keep. This is an erotic, captivating story in 1960s Amsterdam about the legacy of a massive tragedy. But I've already probably given too much away. So the less you know about this book, the better. Just fucking pick it up. Number 3 is Orbital. This book just won the Booker. It takes place in space, but this is a love letter to planet Earth and the loneliness and the smallness of humanity and what we do to survive on this planet. It is a fever dream. You read it so quickly. It's incredible. I highly recommend it. And number 2 is also Northwoods, just lyrical, imaginative story about a piece of land in Western Massachusetts, a place that's very special to me. And this story is so romantic and beautiful and funny and quirky and interesting. And I loved it. And number 1 is The Bee Sting, Paul Murray, a book that we're going to talk about today. This is the book, I think, that inspired this podcast, no? Would you say? I mean,
Yeah, I think we all read this around the same time. And
yeah.
we were all having, I bought this book last winter, I want to say. I'd read about it. It seemed intriguing to me. And then at some point, RJ read it. And at some point, you got it. And then I read it. And like, we were all just kind of like, you know, texting about certain segments. And then as the year went on, I think that of all the books that we read in conjunction and separately, this was the one that we all talked about the most together.
Yeah, there's so much to get into. Should we just get into it? Should we start?
Let's do it.
Let's
I
do
just want to say
it.
hi to Tim Wheaton, who's in the chat. Hey, Tim.
Oh yeah. Hey Tim.
Hi, and yeah, thank you. We'll let you know about spoilers. Oh, I'm glad you read Orbital too. Awesome. So yeah, today we are talking about The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. This is the 4th book by the Irish author, and it takes place in a small Midlands town post-financial crisis, which hit Ireland especially hard. It's an incredibly moving portrait of a family in crisis, both internal and external, and they are a frustrating but lovable bunch who constantly get in their own way and make choices that come from the right place but are often wrong. And the writing forces the reader to shift allegiances between the characters due to the changing perspectives of each section of the book. And the book gets into so much of what it means to be human and be in a family, and how our past and future weigh on our decisions. This is a captivating, propulsive, and devastating read that I thought just left me reeling. And I think it's just one of those really broad, epic books that's hard to put down. Just pretty exciting. But I think it'd be interesting to think about this book and who we would recommend this book to and why. So, Brian, why don't you go first?
So I have like 4 types of people I'd recommend this to, but this is probably all just like one person who likes all these different things. If you like fucked up family epics, this is absolutely for you. If you're interested in the Great Recession and really see it as like a key period in history, this is a great, this gets into the discussion we had in our first episode about what is historical fiction, because like you could classify this as a historical fiction document of what happened in 2008, 2009, 2010. But also people who can find hope in a hopeless world, and then people who are okay with ambiguity. If you're okay, and this is going to be something that we're not going to give this away in any sort of sense right now, but there's a lot of ambiguity at the end of this book that you kind of have to be able to wrestle with and enjoy that process of to really get this. So that's kind of when I was thinking about who I would recommend this to or who I would keep this away from. That's where I would go.
What about you, RJ?
Well, I think historical fiction is nonsense. So I would not recommend this
Same.
book to anyone who likes historical fiction.
I'm making that argument too.
I know.
I agree with you. But
I think
I thought we settled that on the last episode very clearly.
We did.
I agree with you, Brian, just about, family. It's obviously a family drama, like Corrections. If you like Friends, and it's definitely along those lines. I mean, to me, this is like a master class in character development. For a lot of reasons that we'll talk about, but that's what I liked about Intermezzo too, which I just finished. Like some books you read and they are about the plot, and it's like what will happen, and the characters are developed enough that you believe in the plot and the journey. But this was like you're living inside of these characters' turmoil for 600 pages. It's crazy. So I think to me that's the main selling point of the book, is the character development.
Definitely. Yeah, and I agree. I think that it's really a book for people who like to go deep and get fully absorbed and not afraid to make a big commitment to a piece of art. This isn't an easy read. It's not Joyce or, something really challenging to read, but it does take a lot of effort, particularly in the Imelda sections, because there is no punctuation. So it does take a commitment. And I think, you have to be able to feel okay feeling unsettled when you read. Things are not going to be tied up in a tidy bow. You're not going to have that satisfying, movie ending. And it's messy. It's like real life. So if you like that in your art, then this is for you.
I just want to note that there were people on Goodreads who did find it to be very hard to read and were very sad.
It's not that hard.
It's not that hard, but there were people who gave it 1 star or 2 stars or whatever because of the different perspectives and the punctuation. And I mean, if you want to read like, beach reads, for lack of a better term, like go for it. But that's definitely not what this is. But I didn't find it hard. I just found it like,
I think it's one of those
different
books. Yeah, I think it's one of those books that I think you guys are saying this. It's challenging, but it's almost one of those books that it rewards you for trying, because it's not going to take 50, 60 pages for a certain plot point to be resolved. It's going to go deep and give you color and give you perspective in a way that even if you're challenged specifically in the Imelda section, which if you guys haven't said, there's no punctuation in that segment of the book. They do like 130 pages on the mother of the family, and there's not a single punctuation mark in this segment. And for a lot of people, and like I know for myself, when I started reading it, I kind of had to reset my brain of how I was going to read it. But once you get in the rhythm of it, it delivers in a sense that you end up feeling a little bit more accomplished, rather than feeling like you're being beaten down by form and structure in a way that reading like kind of some of the classics can do to you.
Yeah, and this is the pace of it is very fast. Like, this is not a book that feels laborious to read in any stretch
That
of
too.
imagination. Like, you are moving, and it is moving quickly, and it is hard to put down this book. So I think that saying that it's not easy to read is maybe a little bit not right, because it's hard not to read. But yeah, I think it's if people don't like any complexity in their art, then I guess I can see why this would be a problem. But I think that this is, I mean, to me, this is very readable, but excellent literature, which I think is the goal, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
What
just
people
sorry if
should
everyone,
want.
I'm sorry that it was so hard for people to read.
Do better,
Sorry, by
people.
the way. Do better.
We should also note that Paul Murray wrote the entire first draft of this book by hand, and it reads like that,
Unbelievable.
where he's
Yeah.
just sitting there, just like stream of consciousness ideas. I feel like to get to this level of, coherent characters, and RJ, you're absolutely right. I think it's a great point to make that, like, you could almost care nothing about the plot of this book. The characters
Mhm.
will win you over more than anything. The fact that he's created these characters that feel so real and so lifelike, while also diving just as far into the depths of their past and what their personalities are, can kind of only happen if you're just like sitting there writing it out by hand.
Yeah, and I listened to an interview with him, and he was talking about writing this book, and said that he originally had kind of like outlined 3 different stories and brought them to his editor. His editor was like, "Let's make a story. Let's write a book you can, turn around quickly in a couple years." And he had sketched out this like romantic comedy about this girl from the Midlands, and he brought it in, and they were like, "Yeah, this is the one you should do." And he went home to write it, and he was like, "Yeah, no, I already know what this whole thing is. Like, I'm totally bored by that. But like, who's this girl?" And like, just started writing casts, and then it kind of spoiled out from there. And to think that he just sat down then and wrote 700 pages by hand is just unbelievable. He's incredible talent. I think we should start getting into the meat of this, though, because there's so many themes in this book, and they're done so well. And I want to start there. So, RJ, why don't you start us off with one of the themes that you feel like is really present in this book?
Well, I think the main theme is, which we've touched on a little bit and is kind of all encompassing, is just how really it's about this family that all has their own inner demons, I guess. And the entire book basically to me is about people not either asking for help when something goes wrong, or admitting that something's going wrong, or telling the truth about something going wrong when they have the chance. And then that like turns the whole entire life, their entire life, like into a different direction. And that happens like multiple times. And it's just interesting that like the way that they switch between perspectives, it kind of allows you to see the misunderstandings and the mistruths and how they play out and how they like metastasize. And so like you'll see one thing from one character's perspective, and then you'll see another character's reaction to that, and what the person didn't tell the other person, but what actually happened, which just is so stressful. But everything kind of is like a game of telephone between the characters, and it just adds to this like sense of confusion, and everyone's kind of lying to each other, but not in like an overt way where it's like lying, cheating, stealing sort of stuff. It's all minor things that if the characters had just said the thing that like this fucked up thing happened and it's embarrassing, but like it happened, like the whole book would have ended there and everything would have been fine, right? But these things compound and they build on each other, and like you're inside of their struggles while it's happening, and it's so painful but so engrossing. But I think that format of different perspectives from different characters allows for that you to see how those misunderstandings just compound and build on each other and make everyone's lives so much worse. It's so crazy.
It's so hard to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those books that you just kind of know after a certain point that things are not going to necessarily work out. And I think you're absolutely right, RJ. You once you pick up on kind of the pacing of the book and how Murray resolves certain small conflicts, you kind of just accept like this isn't going to end well, and I'm either here for it or I'm not. I think to your theme, I had two that were similar. I won't really expand on them because I think you said it all really well. But like the nature of truth, like whose truth are we actually telling when there's multiple
Yeah.
perspectives in place here, and also this kind of question I kept asking throughout it of, can you halt a crisis in real time? Like, is there a
Mm.
path where you know that this is expanding and getting worse and piling up, and everything you're saying is actually turning it into a bigger deal than it was originally? And is there a place where you can say, stop, like this is done, this like I'm gonna come clean? Because if you come clean the first time, it's just kind of like you just look like an idiot. But like if you expand upon this over years and years and years, um, it actually ends up being a big deal. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that that's really great insight.
And Megan,
Yeah.
before you can I just throw something out there, because I think the title
Yeah.
itself is like indicative of all of this. And like this book could have been
Totally.
called any number of things, but it's focused on this like one single event that represents so much in the book, and
Yeah.
is
Genius.
so many different interpretations of what this bee sting was, and then you find out what it is. I mean, it just that is like that encompasses the entire kind of dynamic we were just talking about.
It's an
100%.
absolutely genius title for a characterization of something that is supposed to the outer world, define who Imelda is in a way that she's this vain person that didn't want the world to see her on her wedding day with a bee sting on her face, so she wears her veil over. And meanwhile, spoiler alert, she's been abused by her father, and she's spending the entire wedding searching for the ghost of her love, and it's so tragic because there's so much of this book about how concern about judgment from the outside world, whether it's in your family or in society or in the community, and how unfruitful that is, and how it often kind of is so different from what's actually happening in the family. It's so fascinating. I think the biggest theme for me in this book was this idea of destiny versus free will.
Mm.
So, about how our lived past and our imagined future kind of weigh on our lives, and how some, or maybe even many or all of our choices we make in life are predestined because of how we grew up, of who raised us, of what happened to them, what trauma or fears they brought to their raising of us. And how do we live with the consequences of those choices when they contradict what we need or want as we get older and we do a lot of therapy and we know ourselves better? But so many of the characters in this book like make choices that go against what they need or they want. And then you watch the fallout from that. And it's internal, it's external, and it continues to get them like deeper and deeper, like you're saying, RJ, into these messes that just seem unfixable. And there's like this denial, and it's kind of becomes a disease that like spreads throughout them as they cling to it. And what's, I think, the best thing about this book though is that so many of these choices come from a desire to do the right thing. And I think
Yeah.
I want to talk about that later on when we talk about the ending of the book, but the book really struggles with these challenges, and it doesn't have a clear answer, which to me is really honest. And I think very few books want to talk about how hard life is and how it never seems to have a conclusion in the way that we want or the way that we hope, but we still keep moving forward. I don't know, that's a lot, but I do think there's a big theme about this idea between destiny and free will.
I thought about that as well. One of my notes was that this kind of covers the idea of hopes for your life colliding with the reality of what your life actually has become and what your life actually is. And I think like beyond what you said, we all kind of compared this at the top to great works by like Jonathan Franzen, for example, who gets into the nitty gritty of American families. And one thing that he does really well, and I think one thing that this book does really well, is it gets you into these settings in these houses and in rooms and in pubs and in storefronts, that aren't really that attractive and aren't really like when you imagine what your life will become and you imagine what your career will be and what your salary will be. And so what type of aesthetic like of a room you'll live in, a lot of the places that are described in here and a lot of the places and a lot of the Franzen books are just kind of like kind of shoddy and like reflect a person who hasn't quote unquote lived up to their expectations of education or where their standing is in the world. But as a reader you still want to like linger in those spaces, and I think it's a huge
Yeah.
accomplishment to like make you want to be in these settings that aren't very attractive at all. And it gets to the heart, and I think it's what gets to the reality of like reading this book. These are characters on a page, but it feels so close to real life because they are so deeply flawed. And to your point, Meg, they're making decisions within a lot of cases the best of intentions with everything, all the information they have right now, what they're capable of. And all of us know that it's just going to lead to
Yeah.
further, you know, uh unappealing settings that they have to live in and further compromises that they have to make for the dreams of their life versus what they actually have to deal with to just survive at the base level of where they're at.
Yeah, when you're saying that, I keep picturing the Dickie's like garage, the office in the
Yeah.
garage, right? Like so
You
much
know what those
happens
places
there.
smell like, and like you don't want to
Yeah.
spend 8 hours a day there, but like people do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Can we just talk? Can I talk just about the writing a little bit, just in the
Yeah.
context of this,
Yeah.
like particularly like the contrapuntal format? That's the word.
Oh, really? That's fancy. Will you say that again?
Contrapuntal,
I don't know that word.
like how just like bringing different perspectives in a series. The way that first of all it speeds up toward the end, which I think maybe Covenant of Water does the same
God.
thing, or a lot of books do that, where you
Demon
like you get
Copperhead.
Demon Copperhead. You get shorter chapters toward the end, which is like as a reader, it's like impossible to stop.
Thank you.
From a
Yeah.
practical
Yeah, exactly.
from a practical
Yes.
perspective, you're like, oh well, I could read like one more page or like two more pages, and then
Mhm.
it's a really good device for like keeping people engaged. But the way that it uses that format to reveal the secrets, like we were talking about the title, which you just talked about, like you don't find that out until maybe like 2/3 of the way through the book.
Yeah.
So you like find out the secrets that they experience that they're living the consequences of now. You find that out much later. So it's almost like it keeps you engaged in a way that like gives you surprises or resolutions along the way. So it's not like you find out that
Totally.
this thing happens and then you see the character what happens to them after. You find out what happens after and then you find out what happens, which just is just a really interesting, and I'm sure it's like fairly common, but it's a really good way to keep you like hooked on the book, because then you're like on to the next thing and you're like, what else are we going to find out? I mean, it's like I said, it's probably common, but I think for this book it was particularly noteworthy because of the way that it went in between characters, and then you'd find out these crazy things like what happened to Dickie when he was in college or whatever. Like you find that out like almost very far into the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy writing, and I want to know, like, how do you even plot that out? Is that like something you plot out on like a whiteboard and then you figure out when you're gonna like reveal that? Like just from a technique perspective, it's fascinating.
I think he just wrote it. From what I understand about his process, I don't think he plotted this out.
I get that sense too, and I think that
It's
like
insane.
It's insane.
compared to the other book that I have in my top spot in 2024, Northwoods, this feels less organized from a structural standpoint. Like it ends up working
Yeah.
out, but there is like, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but like I think that a critique someone could make that I would not make because I personally think this works is that it is really sloppy around the edges. Like he's giving you a lot of a character and he's just like
Yeah.
dumping out all ideas about that character and then moving on to another and then another, and then like you said, towards the end you start to get these internal conversations between all of these characters. But the first, like, I don't know, when does Dickie's section end? Like page 500? Like the first, 6/8 of the book are this, like here's one character, here's another character, here's another character with seemingly no editing to make them like
Yeah.
you're getting more because he is realizing more of the depth of the story is what it felt like. So I think to your point, Meg, this is more he just threw it down on paper rather than saying, I want to give this much weight to Cass and then this much weight to Imelda. And then like, Dickie will get this and then we'll go back and forth. This kind of gets us into our next segment, but I just want to give one quick theme here before we jump on, which I've been thinking about a lot with this book, is that it explores the impact of financial ruin,
Mm.
which is the crisis in this book in a lot of cases. If the financial crisis hadn't hit Ireland the way that it did and impacted Dickie's auto repair shop the way that it does, there's an argument to be made that this family is just kind of like a lot of families outside of crisis. They've all got kind of demons underneath the surface. They've all got hopes, aspirations. They're all individuals, but they're all collectively together. But you add in the stress and the pressure of financial ruin and what that does from a survival standpoint, but also what it does from a perspective standpoint around a small community. And it just kind of like, it just like twists these characters and makes them all go slightly insane because they have to solve this problem in a way that none of them actually are capable of solving because the problem has become so much bigger than um you know what any of them could have ever actually like anticipated it being.
And they had money at first. And I think that's the hard thing too, is that they had a different lifestyle and they lose it, and what that does to a family and what that does to someone. Yeah. Before we move on, I just want to share one last theme because it's kind of tied into what RJ was talking about with the writing. I think this evolving viewpoints, it really does, like you said, RJ, heighten the misunderstanding between characters. It also makes the book feel really, really haunted. And haunting and the idea of death, to me, are huge themes of this book. There are people we love die, dreams we have die, versions of ourselves die, and these deaths haunt us. And this happens in this book so much. And this is an Irish book. I am mostly Irish. So as the Irish person, I have to explain this, that Irish people love to talk about haunting. When I met my family and my ancestral family in Ireland a long time ago, my parents took us there. We stayed up all night in a pub and they just told us ghost stories the entire night about all of these people in our family that have been haunted and all these hauntings and places that you can get haunted if you go. And there's just, in Ireland, there's a lot of mysticism and there's a lot of this idea of when people die, they're still there. And there's that Pet Cemetery quote from PJ that's in the beginning of the book. And then it's also circled back to the end when he's talking about when things die, can they come back? And it's unnatural for things to come back and they should stay dead. Can you resurrect something that is dead? And just this idea of being haunted. And I think these characters are so haunted by who they've wanted to be, who they're not, who they are. And I love that theme of the book.
And part of that is that I made a note of this, and then I can just bring it up now. Like, so many of the main characters' journeys are focused on this one person who has died a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
And like, I feel like a lot of literature is, obviously there are people who die, like Covenant of Water, like everyone died. Someone died like every
everyone
5 pages.
dies.
But and then the person's memories of them, as like, again, chronologically, the version of themselves changes because of what happened with this person dying. Like, that's how it typically works, right? But I don't think I've read a lot of books where a dead character is so well developed and so
Totally.
developed in terms of how his life and death affected every other character, that it's like he's like a main character but was like he died 30 years or whatever before the present day. And it's just interesting that, like, there's obviously portraits of him while he was alive in the book, but the fact that there's like a character who's deceased in the whole time frame of the book's current era, that is like one of the most well developed of the whole book is kind of crazy. But that's probably, to your point, Megan, it's probably part of that kind of perspective on how people from the past like stay present.
Yeah, and if you think about it as like you're reading this within the time frame of 2008, 2009, 2010, you think about this character as, yes, they're like setting it, it's not all flashbacks, but they are through these character eyes, memories of this person. And so how is he being distorted, and who was he in the 1990s? Who actually was he as a person, and what would have happened had certain things not worked out? And um I'm blanking a little bit on on where exactly he went as a character before everything came to the end, but I seem to recall things were not working out for him at
No,
all. Yeah,
he was
thank
like
you.
drinking and he was doing a lot of drugs and yeah.
Yeah, and he was throwing away like a really promising
Hmm.
career, and he didn't want to go and work in his dad's shop at all. And there was a sense of like, if this character lives, what actually ends up happening? And then, if you've lost anyone in like a shocking way close to you, you kind of get that sense of like, you know, on the one hand, in the present, you want them to be there. On the other hand, what would have happened to them, and what looming crises were there for that person that would have changed how you or any number of people would have viewed them? It makes you start to question things about a person. I think you're absolutely right, RJ. I don't recall a character I've read who is
No.
deceased the entire book who I feel like is right there.
Well, and it also speaks to that thing that a lot of families do where they've idealized the person that's no longer there anymore.
Oh my
And
God, yeah.
he's become like this mythic person where if he was still alive, everything would be okay, right? Dickie wouldn't have to do this because he felt like he had to do this because he had to take Frank's place. And Imelda would be happy, even though, like, who knows, because they were already having trouble and they were not even married yet. But it's like, oh, if we had our golden child, this super talented, really good looking guy, everything would have been fine in our family.
Well, and the idea that the two children at the center of this book, who are your way into this book, is through Cass and PJ's eyes.
Yeah,
Neither of them exist if it's Frank and Imelda.
right. That's true.
Like they're just gone.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So cool. Okay, we need to get into our next segment. Let's talk about, I mean, we've been talking about it already, but a little bit more about what this book does really well. I mean, there's a million things.
Wow.
I know. Brian, why don't you start us off?
So my first note, it kind of expands on what I was just saying when we've talked a little bit about this, but I'd love to know you guys' perspective. So the way the book is structured is from the perspective of each character. And a big difference between this and say a Franzen book that does a similar thing is he bounces between all of the characters, so that by the time you're 400 pages in, you've heard from the father 6 or 7 times, the daughter number of times, the wife, and you've gotten all these different perspectives. With this book, you get one person's perspective for around 100 to 200 pages. And then it's not until the very end that they start to repeat and kind of spiral around each other. And so I found that to be really interesting, especially because you come into the book from Cass and PJ's perspective. And so it's a family in crisis that you're reading about from teenage kids. And your initial view is to sympathize with these characters and sympathize with these kids, and that their parents are really messed up people who have really destroyed their lives and destroyed their hopes and dreams. And then as you get into the parents, you get to see how their life has evolved over time, and you start to suddenly see the kids from a different perspective as well. And I felt like from a structural standpoint, it not only gave you all this time with an individual character, so for days on end, you're literally living in one person's perspective. But by the time you get to Dickie, you've heard everything awful that could possibly be said about this person as a dad, as a
Yeah.
husband, as a businessman, as a community member. Like you think of this guy as one of the most pathetic people that you've ever encountered. And you can kind of start to think about, people in your own life where you're like, oh, they always do something wrong, or like there's there's a sense reading him of someone who had an opportunity but failed. And then you get into his story, and it's so much deeper and so much more tragic and so much more intense than you could have imagined. And I think if you flip that around and you enter through Dickie's story, it's a totally different book, and it doesn't
Mm,
have that same shock value and that same power, because suddenly the kids challenges and the kid's experience doesn't necessarily mean as much.
Yeah,
Curious
that's so
what you- yeah.
interesting to think about that. The way that you enter the story is very untraditional, is very non-traditional or untraditional. I think it's interesting to start with the least reliable narrator, basically.
Right.
Like a teenage girl, I don't know, you know, I mean, like I think it's an unreliable narrator in a way, but then you kind of find out that they're all unreliable in a way. And I think that's what's kind of the magic of the book is that like, yeah, it just forces you to be subjective about the characters and what they're doing and realize how confusing that can be when you have to decide who is right and who is wrong.
Yeah, and like to that point, he never insults these characters to the
No.
sense of like when you're in Dickie's segment, you've already built up this empathy for, say, Cass, and it's not as though her needs and her wants are ever minimized, but they are put into a perspective that I don't think they would be if you saw her post, like if you were introduced to Dickie and then experienced her experience. What about you, RJ?
Yeah. I was reading a couple of reviews of the book, and all the reviews that I read talked about how great this. I haven't read Skippy Dies, which I know is much more about young people.
Mm.
So maybe that's part of it. But like a lot of these reviews talked about how good he is at like communicating the perspectives of like teenagers, which I think is interesting because that wasn't a takeaway of mine. But I think in terms of like the structure, it like everything you said,
Mhm.
Brian, I agree with. That's like it's all set up to. It's a crazy way of setting up character development where you have this. I feel like most books, like you get a perspective on the character, and then if it goes to that character's perspective, it's sort of like it's not that much different from what you have read from other people's perspectives, and that's just more of like a narrow look at how people see each other because obviously like there's a lot of difference, right? So it's like a more realistic way to think about it. But I agree with like what you said, Megan, about giving like the unreliable characters the first crack at it is interesting and sets the whole thing up for being like whose perspective is actually
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
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 I think he's amazing. I heard him talking about that, about writing about Cass particularly. And he said something really interesting. And he was talking about the author when who was writing Lolita used to sit in the back of buses and like listen to teenage girls. And he's like, obviously I can't do that anymore. And they were like laughing about it. But he was saying, how different are any of us really? Like we all have the same needs and wants and insecurities. It's just how we talk about them. And I thought that was so interesting. And I do think that's one thing that the book does so well. Like you were saying, Brian, each perspective is just as valid and weighted. Like your allegiances shift because you believe who's ever telling you that part of the story. And he really honors like each of their gifts and weaknesses. You think of like there's this drama and tragedy and Irish shine, like we call it in my family, in Imelda's section. And then there's cerebral frustration and self-flagellation and this like deep loneliness in Dickie's. I think at one point he calls himself a sorrowful creature of endless need. It's just so like, ugh. And then Cass has that intoxication, a female teenage friendship. It's emotional and erotic, and I think that is really hard to capture. And there's such a desperation and a deep love that teenage girls feel for each other, and he nailed that like so perfectly. And then PJ's struggle to kind of grasp onto something that he can rely on and having that continually just fall through his hands, which is just so sad. But I think that being able to represent those perspectives evenly is such an incredible accomplishment.
I mean, I remember reading and getting to the Imelda section and already feeling like a defined animosity towards her as a person.
Yes, totally.
And
She
not,
comes across terrible.
yeah, and not really wanting to feel any sort of empathy towards her. And within 2 or 3 pages, he just immediately allows you to be like, okay, this is a person as well with a lot of layers, and this is why they're this way. What about you, Meg? What is something you think that the book did really well?
What I think I kept being surprised by is how the book expands and contracts. There's like big and little moments, and he does them so well. He's able to tell this huge story and hold on to larger themes, but still giving you really fully painted details and a rich world that they happen in. Even the peripheral characters are drawn well. It's sort of the opposite Covenant of Water in that way. Like, think about just the boy at college that Dickie falls in love with at Trinity. And there's just this, he's pretty inconsequential. I mean, like he is important to Dickie's development, but he's not someone that matters to the plot of the story really. But he's given such depth and you really feel like you know him. It's, to me, that's such an incredible thing to be able to do, paint broadly and really detailed at the same time.
Yeah, there's a lot of like extremely inconsequential moments that you spend 2 or 3 pages on, and I don't think the book is the same without. It's kind of like what I was
Yeah.
saying earlier, where it feels like you could make the argument that an editor would have brought this down to like 400 pages, made it a
Mhm.
little bit more accessible, but I think takes away from the magic where you get these just tiny minute moments that feel like a real life in such a powerful way.
Yeah,
RJ?
I mean, I think that it's really like it's a pretty funny book, all things considered.
Oh yeah. Oh
Oh,
yeah.
it's
which I think is
hilarious.
something
Yeah.
I
that,
don't
like,
I don't I don't
does
think we've
does
mentioned
well.
that. You're right.
No,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's
it
the
is
point.
really funny.
I
Mhm.
feel like there's little things, you know, of course there's like the kind of observational humor, you know, just that mostly just like that people are ridiculous and whatever, but then there's actual like kind of funny moments. There's like a story about a woman dies after slipping on a guava and falling. There's just like little things that I think maybe inconsequential in terms of the reading experience, but you know, this book is like slightly about like climate change and global apocalypse and all these people living their worst nightmares. So like I feel like the humor helps, you know, it helps you stay afloat in the reading, which I think is really like I think it does that really well because it's hard to balance between all this, you know, stuff, horrible stuff that's happening, and still have some levity, which I think is hard to do.
Some of the best like pub writing I've ever read. Like I felt like I could hear like when you're in a pub and there's, 50 people all having individualized conversations and one rises and then you have to rise along with it. Like there were so many scenes in this book where I felt like I could just like smell Guinness and like feel that like small town glow of being in the pub after a big important match.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, yeah. And like you said, Megan, like specific detail, but also keeping like some of it's very, very, they let you fill in the details, but in some ways, like the detail is really, man, it's crazy. Yeah.
He's also really poetic, and there
Yeah.
are so many just pages and pages of examples of how he explains love or sex or family obligations or how we see ourselves out like outside, and each one is just gorgeous. And I think that's always surprising to me a little bit when a novelist is able to be that poetic. He's just incredibly talented.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting to think about what the book did not do well. This is a little bit harder maybe for all of us, but Brian, what did you feel like the book struggled with or maybe just didn't need or
I really struggled to like find something I would have taken out of this book because I loved this book and it's one of those any sort of flaws you get this sometimes with like a great album or with a great movie where like someone could say like, well, yeah, there's this and this flawed. And you're like, yeah, but those worked for me and I'm okay with those being in there. I think like if I'm going to really nitpick, I think that there could have been some structural benefit to more traditionally bouncing between the characters in a little bit more of an even manner. It would have given you, a bit more of, especially from the kid's standpoint, their perspective as these new bits of information from the parents' past is being unveiled to you as the reader. But even as I say that, I think about the fact that like so much of that the kids were learning in the moment themselves, as the book was unfolding. And so it's not necessarily as like it would have helped them as characters. I mean, I think that the biggest thing to call out, it's not something I had an issue with, but it's something we're definitely going to have to talk about, is the ending. You know, this book endlessly builds tension. There's no real point where you kind of stop and just kind of exist in the story for 50
Mm-mm.
pages. You're moving forward at like an ever increasing pace. Um, and so for that, like, it does reach a climactic ending that just, spoiler alert, just ends. And I think maybe this is a time to talk about that, but I, I would just close like what did it not do well? I don't know. This is almost like a perfect book to me, even in spite of its flaws.
RJ, what do you think?
Yeah, I got nothing. I mean, I
I
wish I
tried, but
had something. I think you're right. I mean, the ending, it's really hard for me and probably for you, Brian, to not think about The Sopranos when you think about the ending. Like
Totally.
the whole point of the ending is that it leaves you with like this ambiguity, you know? I mean, and people are still on Goodreads and elsewhere like talking about what they think happened at the end. That's so much better for the book and for the author and
Right?
for readers, I think, than like, I mean, what would have been a better way to end it, to like say that the kids, you know, spoiler alert, that they get shot? I mean, I don't like, it sounds worse. I think you come away from it enjoying the book less if there was a specific ending, especially given the way that it like built up. I mean, I think it was a pretty amazing way to end the book.
I agree. I think that there's no argument to be made that said that he couldn't like think of an ending. I mean, he's a fucking amazing writer. I think the whole book is a cascade of cliffhangers. There's just a cliffhanger and you don't know if things are going to be okay. And then in the next section, you found out they are. And that just keeps happening over and over again. And so for me, it makes sense that this is a cliffhanger ending. It also keeps the options open. And isn't that how life is? Like, even when you think you've made choices, there's always choice, like more choices to be made and more decisions to be made. And I think any of the endings that you can kind of play out for this book, they seem a little bit unfulfilling to me, because there's basically two roads, right, that it goes down. Like, either there's another massive tragedy that continues to shatter them and splinter them off, or they come together because of another tragedy, or because of they just narrowly miss one. But in either case, both of those just seem like, I don't know, unfulfilling in a way. Like, I think it's better to imagine that you get to decide what happens for these people, and their lives are going to continue to be ambiguous and hard and challenging and not perfect, and they're going to make bad decisions. And I think it's just so exciting to leave a book this way, because it really, I think, trusts the reader to fill in the blanks in a way that I really like. You know, it's like when you see a painting, and you don't know everything about it, you know, and
Yeah.
you don't really know like what it was about or why, but it hits you so hard. And it's not like you need to know everything about the painting to connect to it. And this piece of art to me just left me with so many things to think about. And that's like what I really want from art.
Yeah, it kind of like gets to the point of like, sometimes you just don't need an ending. And I thought of this book when I was reading it. It was almost like, in my mind, it was like seeing a marble going into a funnel, and like you get these like big swoops of just like,
Mm,
here's a full perspective of this character as it's making a rotation, and then you get another one, you get another one. By the end of the book, like the marble's just like spinning around about to go down the funnel, and everything's just like sped up, and you got this like sense of like one disaster is leading to another disaster. And something RJ said at the earlier in the episode, the idea of like bad decisions being compounded upon each other, and people are and you said this as well, Meg, like people are trying to make the right decision. And I think in that moment, all four of these main characters think that they're making the right decision in terms of how to solve something. But to your point of like the two paths of where it ends, big spoiler alert. If the kids or Imelda get shot, and if they die, do you need that tragedy to compound this? Like does that
Right.
actually add anything to the book? I don't think so. And then on the other hand is like, if they avert tragedy and then they come together, that to me, based on how he wrote this, that's another 400 pages, and that's a whole nother
Yeah.
story of like a family coming back together. So I guess you could do that. That would be a true epic of like a family breaking apart and then coming back together, and all happening halfway through the book. But I don't know if that's necessarily what he felt like he needed to go for. And I think that, to your point of like how much he gave you in this book, to me, the ending then almost doesn't matter. It's just
Mhm.
something is about to happen that is going to trip these characters into the next phase of their life. And reading this, it's probably not going to be good. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
probably not going to be beneficial to these people. And that tragedy is just kind of um like that's a part of what you've accepted within this book. So to me, you didn't need to say anything, because as you read and as you were invested in this, you kind of know what direction we're going to go in here. Um, yeah, I don't know. I can see why someone would have put so much time into this and been like, well, we have to have some clarity by the end. But I feel like so much of the book is about that foggy perception of what is truth, what is actually happening,
Yeah.
that if he applied it, it's false compared to where the book actually originated and what it did over the 600 pages.
Okay, so we're agreed. The ending was perfect.
I think it was
I
pretty
do.
great.
I thought it
It's
was
pretty
awesome.
great, right? Yeah, it was so like, I mean, my heart was like beating out of my chest when I was reading it. It was just like, what is happening? And the way it builds so intensely up to the end. I mean, the sections start getting like 2, 3 lines in between characters. I
Yeah.
just reread it last week and I was like, oh my God, like this is insane. It's like a runaway train. I have one thing though that I wanted to ask you about that I don't know if the book needed.
Yeah.
The climate change angle. Do we need this on top of the story? Like, what does it add? Yes, there's like a synchronicity to like the world collapsing and not being taken care of appropriately. But to me, it just feels like, and obviously it's timely, but it just felt like an added layer of thematic
This is our
thought. I
second
don't know.
element of historical fiction. We should have like a new segment of like the end is historical fiction making entrance into a book.
This is not
Uh,
historical fiction because everything
know.
takes
I
place at a
agree with
certain
you.
time. Like, this is insane.
I agree with your argument. I think I think I agree with you. I think it do you mean like the entire bunker building aspect of
No,
this,
that's
or like
awesome. No, because the
the
bunker
fears of
building
climate
is like
change?
he's really building that to like escape reality. Like to me, that's more of a metaphor for him, like not wanting to
Yeah.
do reality. So he creates this project that is very requires a lot of him, and for saving his family and like, and that's like his whole mind frame. But really, it's just a way to like escape his real problems and like pretend they don't exist and spend time with this like weirdo. And I think that it's just driving him further away. So I think that metaphor is like super strong. But I don't know if you need this like idea of like this pressing climate change thing that people feel like the world is also collapsing too. I don't know.
I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that the whole book is about climate change. Like
Mhm.
the character, the plot, to the extent that it is important, and the characters are basically like everyone's on the wrong path. They know they're on the wrong path, and they still can't or won't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that is
Yeah.
climate change. So like,
Yeah. It's true.
I feel like it's
And they
like
keep making decisions that are making it worse, like what
making it
we're doing.
worse.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know if I didn't read any interviews with him, but I don't know if he talked about that, if this is supposed to be like an allegory for climate change or not. But it feels like the way that the story and the characters work is exactly the same thing that's happening with climate change, which is like careening toward disaster, and nobody's like willing to admit bad things in order to try and fix it.
Well, because that would
So
take like a big shift of like we have to do things really differently.
yeah,
And people don't
exactly.
want to do that. I never thought about that. I think that's really true. So maybe you do need it.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's also kind of annoying when that happens in books because it's like
I know.
it feels like it can feel heavy-handed, but I do think it was like you said about the financial crisis, Brian. It feels kind of central to the time.
Mhm.
So
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think the themes and the inclusion of aspects of the Great Recession are more impactful, but those all, you go forward 150 years in history, if people are still hosting podcasts and talking about literature, like this could be a book that you talk about as like that's what it felt like to live in the early 2010s when climate change hadn't fully taken over the kind of temperate zones of the world. But this great slowdown in GDP, this increase in climate change disasters are starting to affect people. And so while
Mm.
people within the community and within Ireland at large may survive the kind of early waves of climate change, and it's perfectly like real, like think about disasters that are happening in America right now that are taking out entire communities, whereas you could be in a different part of the country and literally not feel it and know it's
Mhm.
going on and feel it as like something that's happening in the news, but not actually have it really impact your life. And I think that's an interesting place that we find ourselves. I really don't want to push this historical fiction argument because I'm in full agreement with you guys that it's like a dumb concept. But it does add this element of like what is happening in the moment and how do you explore how that builds and explodes in these characters' faces, because they're all dealing with it, whereas their neighbors, their father-in-law, their friends aren't experiencing it at all in this current moment in time.
Yeah. Okay. I might have been talked into that. Fine. They did not. This book does nothing wrong. Great. That's all I had. So now we're agreement that.
I mean,
So
this is like a, it's very rare you get a book like this.
yes, absolutely.
You
I would
know,
say, this is one of my favorite books I've read in the last 5 years. I mean, it's one of my favorite books ever that I've read. It's just that good.
it's a high bar here. Everything is all the other books we're going to talk about just, they don't live up to it. No, I'm joking.
I don't know. We have so many good books to talk about.
We do.
What are some questions we have for each other? Brian, what do you want to ask us?
I am curious which character you guys think was most justified in their actions and why.
Whoa, that's heavy.
Wow.
Damn. Brinkman with the big guns.
Yeah.
I feel like Dickie's sadness is the deepest. Actually, maybe that's not true. Imelda's really sad too. I think Dickie does the dumbest things, but he's the one that I felt like I understood the best because he's just so repressed, and so hard on himself. And maybe because he is smarter. Like I think Imelda is not super intelligent. I think that's fair to say, right? I think that's fair to say that
I
like
think
she's not.
pretty
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
brought
And
across. Yeah.
yeah. And so I don't know if she had the capability to be any more than she is. Like she's this great beauty, and that's like her strength and her power. But she never. And I think she has a mysticism and like she's in touch with spirituality in a way that I think is really amazing. But she doesn't have. I didn't relate to her as much because she's not thinking about what she does in a really thoughtful way. And I feel like Dickie is really smart, but has lost so much of himself because he's so repressed. And I don't know. I just found him to be someone I felt for the most.
Yeah. I mean, everyone has like gone through such horrible things that they have
I know.
never discussed with anyone else that it's hard to choose, you know? Um, but I think because they're both like the parents, you know, I think equally for me are like, it's
Yeah.
really awful. Like what Imelda had went through, and then like just as a mom, I think taking like you just always kind of get the bad end of the stick in terms of like the kids kind of blame you for everything, but you still kind of do everything, and then everything like goes wrong and it's always your fault. I feel like that's like kind of
Yeah.
how it works, and that's definitely what I saw here. I mean, they're like I said, they're all everyone is so has been through so many horrible things.
I
Um,
know.
I will say that. Can I go back to the last section real quick? The last
Of
segment.
course.
Yeah,
I
dude.
thought that I thought that the scene, like the resolution of PJ's story of the like clearly fake friend on the internet thing, like I thought that was a little like
Forced.
yeah, like but I mean I guess there had to be a thing that happened to him in that section of the book, but it was like you saw it coming the entire time, and then it was like a scary guy came out of the alley and he like ran away. It was sort of like I wouldn't have wanted him to create like a more horrible scenario for him, but maybe he just was the one family member who didn't like get into this like horrendous thing. Although I guess the chatting back and forth the chatting back and forth is what develops his kind of perspective. So I don't know. But I feel like I connected with that character the least because it just sort of felt the least important to the story, but also like had the most forced aspects of it.
Well, and it's interesting because I almost feel like he's the one that is most justified in his actions because he is the innocent
Mm.
youngest child here who, like, Cass is about to go to college. She's starting to think about adulthood, and she's at an age where you as an individual kind of have to come to terms with the fact that, like, all you've hated about your parents for the last 5 years when you've been wanting to get out of their house, like, oh, I'm gonna actually have to take on those responsibilities over the next 10, 15 years. And it's probably a lot harder than I thought it was, being a repressed teenager who wasn't allowed to go out every night of the week type of thing. Whereas PJ is like, he's still a kid. And there is a sense of like he's literally just looking for friends and he's literally just looking for role models. And
Yeah.
instead he gets roped into this really perverse online scheme that I totally agree with you felt like the second the tone shift between him and the person he was chatting with online, I was like, oh, that is a older man who lives in a basement who is going to do some really awful things. This person, I don't want to actually read that segment. And it was written in a way that like I was sitting on my couch on like a Saturday evening, just like I have to keep reading. Like I can't. So like you got to take the kids because like I can't stop reading this book. And I remember like, it's light outside, there's people everywhere, and I was actually terrified turning the pages.
So scary.
Which
That
is
part
really
was
good.
so scary.
It was horrifying. But I do think like, to your point, like it's probably between Imelda or Dickie. And I think Dickie, in spite of all of his flaws, did as much right as he possibly could to provide for someone who he genuinely seemed to love while also holding back an aspect of himself and sacrificing himself for a business and a family. Although, as I think about it, like maybe Rizard is the most justifiable person, just like a Eastern European immigrant who comes in and
Yeah.
is doing a bunch of work and is just like, hey, these like catalytic converters on your cars, like you can make a lot of money off of this. And like, you guys are already going to have climate change. Like what is this thing on your car that like, it's a luxury item. I'm just going to get rich off of this. I don't know. What do you guys have from a question standpoint?
My question is about the ending. The quote, the last two lines of the book are, so this is a massive spoiler. Dickie has the gun and he recognizes that there's two people or multiple people coming into the view, and he thinks it's, who's been blackmailing him. And the last two lines are, "It is love. You are doing this for love." And I just felt like that was a really intense way to end the book. And I have thoughts about it, but I want to know what you guys think about why Marie chose to end the book with those lines.
I mean, I think that ultimately, like, even though these people we've mostly talked about how they're like all pretty bad, but I think they're not bad people. They're just like they've just all made really bad choices. But I think that was like the reminder that they actually are people who, despite everything, like care about their family and care about the people they love. I think that was like bringing us back to that, which there's not a lot of that throughout the book, but that was definitely like a part of it. It was like there's these people all do like love each other, and it was almost like in a reminder at the end. I think that's what it felt like to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I get that. You don't get this deep with people unless you love them. Like even
Mm-hmm.
when things go horribly wrong. Meg, can you remind me when Imelda and PJ, right, are coming up the hill, they have, or like they're in the forest, they have good news for Dickie, correct?
No, so Cass and PJ have gotten off the bus from Trinity, from
Yeah.
Dublin, and they're walking through the forest, taking a shortcut to the house.
Yeah.
And Cass is bringing PJ back, and Imelda is pissed at Dickie, and she's going to go tell him that she was going to cheat on him tonight. And so
But she didn't.
but she didn't, but only because she's like, she's getting, the Mike keeps pushing it back, and she's like, and then she gets mad. And she's like, well, I'm going to go tell Dickie. And then she's not even home. And then she just races through the forest, and she's like getting like hit by the Strux. And so, no, they're both like, she's coming to yell at Dickie and be mad at him. And the kids are coming
Okay.
home, and Cass is like bringing PJ home.
Right. Okay. I mean, I think I appreciate you recapping it. I mean, I think ultimately similar to what RJ said, like, because Dickie believes at that moment, he doesn't think that it's his family. He thinks that that's an intruder. He thinks it's
Yeah.
Rizard. He thinks that he's doing something right. Like something bad is going to happen to him based on whatever his actions are. But the entire reason he's doing this is for the responsibility he has over this family and the protection he feels like he needs to have for them. So I think he's figured out a way to justify in his own head that whatever I'm doing, whatever sacrifice I'm making right now is for the love of these other people. Even though
Yeah.
we all know it's probably going to end up killing one of his family members.
And I think that's the whole point of this book, right? Is that we justify choices we make thinking they're the right ones. And he thinks he has to make this like terrible choice out of love. He's convinced himself, that he has to kill someone to protect his family. And in the meantime, he's putting them in like the ultimate danger.
Crazy.
So sad. RJ, did you have a question for us?
I don't really have a question. I guess well, can I ask a question from my outline of you?
Yes, please.
what are 3 words that you would use to describe this book?
One would be cacophonous. Excuse me. Just like ideas bouncing around inside my head. I just felt that.
I would say captivating, devastating, and propulsive.
Yeah. Those are all good.
How about you?
Can sewage water be one of them?
I wrote down tense, moving, and funny because I think those are the 3 pieces that stuck with me the most. Moving in that there is this like humanity beneath all these characters, which we only really talked about briefly based on what you just talked about, Megan. But there is like I think we don't even like begin to see that angle of the characters because there's so much horrible stuff happening. But it seems to me that that's probably part of the point of the ending is like, these people all do care about each other. And I think that's something that sticks with you after you finish the book. Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, that's a good place to transition. What is the lasting image from this book that you have? If there's one image you have from the book, what is it?
For me, I felt like of all the characters, I felt like I could see the world from Imelda better than anyone. And it just felt constantly like someone who's moving way too quickly through the world, who's kind of rushing their sentences, who is just like brushing past people, especially later in life, and is like written on their face is a lot of regret and a lot of pain. And I just kept seeing that as I was reading the book. And when I think about this book, sitting down and talking with you guys about it, there's a lot of memories that come out of reading it. But when I just like think in my head, the bee sting, it's all from her perspective.
Hmm.
And it's all this kind
That's
of
so
like
interesting.
very blurry, rushed, kind of schizophrenic, really sad, dark, but also, she has the benefits of beauty. She has, there's a lot of lust towards her. There's a lot that, like, you would think of from a character would be a lot of positives. And instead, you listen to this person and you just constantly think about sadness. And you just think about how she's never able to just sit down and enjoy this life that she has and the things that she's been given. What about you guys?
Yeah, I
That's
mean, I
so
think just
interesting.
yeah, that's not. I mean, for me, it's just the final scene in the woods. Really, is like just because that was it's such a crazy way for it all to resolve, or not resolve, but end. Um,
No
with
resolution.
the rain and like the night vision scope and the like the yelling and I mean, it's that to me is the most is the lasting image is just picturing like that madness.
Yeah, it's such an evocative scene. I think I have two images. One is, it's funny when you said that, Brian, because I'd never really thought about that because I did feel like I related to Dickie more, but then the images I have of the book are of her, and I don't know why that is, but the wedding scene when she
Mm.
thinks she sees Frank, but she sees herself. She thinks she sees like something white and she thinks it's Frank, but then she realizes it's her reflection. And
Yeah, that's crazy.
I love that whole wedding scene and how the wedding scene is overlaid onto the woods scene in the end, because I think the other scene, the other image for me is also RJ the woods, and this feeling of like how Imelda and Dickie start talking to each other like they're at the wedding while they're in the woods, which kind of goes back to like the original choice they made that was wrong, right? To be together and to get married, and they're reflecting on that in this moment when everything feels wrong, and it's so sad to me. And yeah, I think that image of them running around in the rain searching for each other, but they're also lost and desperate, and just will their desperation lead them back together, or will it continue to push them apart?
Yeah.
Mm. Mm.
And that's like the main takeaway, I think, of the ending, which is a good way of
Yeah,
putting it.
I think so too.
Can I just read one quote, which I don't even remember what
Yeah.
part of the book this is from, but when I was like looking back through stuff, this quote kind of summarizes the whole book. I don't remember which character said it, but I remember reading it. Anyway, the quote is, "That's the past, isn't it? You think it's behind you, then one day you walk into a room and it's there waiting for you." Which
Oh,
is sort of like
yes,
the
my
whole,
God. Yes.
kind of like it's like the entire book. It's crazy.
Oh, he's so poetic. I love
Madness.
that. Yeah. Okay, I'm curious what books like this you'd recommend. We've talked a little bit about Franzen, and that was definitely one of my big recommendations. But what other recommendations do you have?
I have a few. I have a quick list. One is Wellness, which is another one of my favorite books that I've read this year. Another kind of book about characters that you find out about the baggage that they're carrying further into the story, and it helps kind of like give color to why they are who they are as adults. It's a great book. I mean, this guy's first book it was called The Knicks. His last book, sorry, which I read.
Oh,
which is
I
like
read
about-
that.
Yeah, I mean, he's great. Very different kind of book than this, but pieces of that. Prophet Song is a book that I read this year that is equally dark and Irish, but much more apocalyptic. And Intermezzo and The Safe Keep. I think The Safe Keep and this book have a lot of similarities in terms of characters not understanding like different perspectives on the truth and relationships in a way that resolves in a different way.
Yeah, I never really thought about that, but I think you're right. There's a lot of not knowing who you really are.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm excited for you to read that, Brian.
I cannot wait. I mean, we did talk friends. I would say just specifically, I read Crossroads last fall, which I think does, between that, Freedom, and the Corrections, I think Crossroads gets to like the closest sense of like a family breaking apart in like a nuclear family setting, and what happens when people start to go down certain roads, and when they make choices that they aren't making them for the wrong reasons, but they ultimately, we just know that it's going to ultimately end up in a horrible place, and that book absolutely does that. But I'm gonna zag here for a second and go with some nonfiction for you, because this is
Ooh,
so set
interesting.
in a time and a place. I am going to go with a book that I read this fall called Homeland: The War on Terror in American Life, that explores the last 20 years in American history, and then broadens the scope and gives you a 500-year history of Western civilization, and puts it in perspective of why the war on terror took the path that it took, and how it has affected people on a very minute scale, but also on like a broad based, where is America going? Where is the West going right now? And I feel like this book and our conversation here, more than anything, has kind of unearthed those sort of questions for me of, the ideas of the American dream, the ideas of, you go to college, you get a job, you have a family, you set up a life. All of those are supposed to be positive things, and they're all what we're taught from childhood we should be doing. But what happens when those sort of ideals start to break down, and what happens on a minute level, but also what happens on a large scale level? So I would definitely recommend that, based off of reading this. And one other, just really quick, I read this earlier in the spring, right before, this was what I read between Northwoods and The Bee Sting. Not the greatest book, but I think it's an interesting perspective. It's called Day. It's about a family in Brooklyn, and it looks at them on April 6, 2019, April 6, 2020, and April 6, 2021. And it uses the pandemic and the before and after as this kind of crux of, what does this large scale experience that a family goes through, what does that actually do to, or that a society goes through, what does that actually do to a family on an individual level? So a lot of big ideas that are then questioned in the small and the minute here.
That's cool. It's nonfiction.
Day was fiction.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's really cool. That's a cool concept. I haven't heard of that. Yeah, I second all of your recommendations. The only things I was going to add are two books that I've actually never read, but they kept coming up in conversation, and one of which I have added to my list now, which a lot of people probably have read, but Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. It's a family tragedy written in varying like narrative styles. I've never read it. Now it's happening next year for me, because if it's like this, I want to read it. And the other book that everybody was mentioning was Ulysses, James Joyce, which I have not read because I am not brave enough or perhaps intellectual enough to read Joyce, but at least not at this point in my life. But everybody kept mentioning that, so I don't really know why, but apparently there's a lot of similarities. So whoever's smart enough to read Joyce can reach out and tell me why it's similar to this book.
I'm saving that
Um,
for retirement, I think.
Yeah, I think I need more
Yeah.
like headspace for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. That'll be my plan too. You can remind me of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the next episode is going to be in January, and we're going to be talking about Northwoods by Daniel
Wow.
Mason, another incredible book. I cannot wait. There's so much to get into in this book. And before we wrap, I think we have time to do just a really quick coda. So let's just tell everybody what we're reading now, just before we go, just for fun. Brian, what are you reading now?
Right now, I am reading 3 books. Still reading my book on revolutions in late 18th and early 19th centuries. I'm halfway through James. I'm hoping to have that finished by the end of the weekend so I can begin Orbital. And I just started
Yay.
today. Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here: The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis, which is a book about the border crisis, the Central American migrant crisis that is very ever present right now. I've heard from a number of people that this is an incredible book, and I'm already deep into it. Really, really enjoying it. So that's what I got. What about you, RJ?
I am almost done with a book called Martyr, which has been talked about a lot. It's a debut novel about an Iranian-born American in his 20s who is a recovering addict, and his mom died in a plane crash. His dad died when he went to college, and he is a poet who's trying to basically write a book about martyrdom. It sounds much more serious than it is. It's funny. It's
Cool.
ridiculous. It's a very good book. I'm sure this guy will be winning awards. But it's been talked about a lot, so I wanted to read it, and I think I'll be done tomorrow, and then I'm on to something else.
Moving quickly, the RJ way. I am reading Orlando by Virginia Woolf. This published in 1928. It's called Orlando, a biography, and it is a satire written about, kind of based on the aristocratic life of her lover, this poet that she was in love with, and also was her close friend. And it is fascinating. It's about this poet who changes from a man to a woman and lives through centuries, meeting like all of the key figures of English literary history. It's kind of considered a feminist classic. It's a bit like taking her medicine, but it's also great because of who she is and where she wrote from, and her perspective is just fascinating. And the other book that I am hoping to finish before the end of the year, that is because it's poetry, I've been reading it here and there. It's Sylvia Plath's collection of poems, Ariel, which I'm halfway through now. This was published originally in 1965, like right after her suicide, and it was curated and arranged by her partner. And he also added in a lot of poems from the last few weeks of her life. But in 2004, they published this manuscript, which is how she intended this collection of poems to be released. And so I'm reading it it's comparing the 2 different manuscripts. And so just seeing what she intended and what her partner put out. And yeah, Plath is intense and beautiful and moving, and it's been fun. So I'm hoping to finish both of those before the end of the year. That's it.
It's mad
Amazing.
dash. 13
Amazing.
years
Yeah.
left. Got to get your final 2024 books in.
I got to reach that round number that I'm searching for. Like I have to. I can't end on like a 29. Like that would just be so awful. It's so awful.
It would make everything you read before just inconsequential at that
Yeah.
point.
It'd be
Right?
so useless. It'd be so useless. Well, this has been so fun. I can't wait to come back next month. In January, we'll be back. So I hope everyone reaches out and lets us know what they're thinking about the pod, and read with us. Northwoods is the next one. You have a few weeks. It's the holidays. Hopefully you'll have some time off. And that book is really worth reading, so you can follow along with us during the episode.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month.
Bye.